Well, yes, hello again. It's another Views from the Veranda. I mentioned last week that I might have a property stylist join me today to talk about preparing a property for sale, but in fact there was some real estate news this week that I really needed to share with you and to give you my views in relation to them. So, some 6 to 7 months ago when COVID landed on our shores, the government at both the state and federal level were very quick to bring in legislation to protect residential tenancies as well as commercial tenancies. They were designed to ensure that someone in a residential tenancy had a roof over their head. In the case of a business, that their premises was protected, even though their income might have been affected by COVID. So the main conditions related to this legislation was, firstly, if you were a landlord, you were prevented from evicting a tenant that was COVID impacted, as long as they could provide some proof and acted in good faith as far as negotiating any rent reductions. In the case of a tenant that wanted to vacate a property, they were able to do that very easily by giving notice and moving on, even if they were in a fixed term lease. If you were needing to, as an owner, if you were needing to have the property vacated for whatever reason, in terms of actually not rental arrears, but if they were a tenant was abusing a property, or in fact in the case of a situation where an owner needed to move back into their own property because of financial difficulties, they had to give over 90 days notice. As an agent or a landlord, if a tenant was in rental arrears, even if they weren't COVID impacted, you couldn't put them on a tenancy database which would indicate that they were in rental arrears. And in the case of boarding houses, it was a similar situation. If a tenant was COVID impacted, they couldn't be evicted. So in case of commercial tenancies, the government brought in what they called a mandatory code. This was a rules and regulations and legislation around the fact that if a business was impacted by COVID, they could virtually stop paying rent or minimise their rent based on the percentage of the income that they were receiving. In most cases, a lot of that rent was waived, so never to be paid back. And if it was to be paid back, then it could be deferred over a long period of time. So that was 6 months ago. This week, the government, in their wisdom, decided to legislate to extend that for another 6 months, without consultation with the real estate industry or any landlords. So yes, look, there was an upside. The New South Wales government brought in what they called land tax relief, or deferment of payment of land tax. That's fine, but that really only helps about 15% of investors and landlords. Most mum and dad type investors just don't meet that threshold. Of course, the banks also offered a moratorium on loan repayments and investment loans. But again, they were a deferment, so they will have to pay them back at some stage or extend the length of their loan. But in the case of a tenant that has their rent waived, they never have to go back and pay that past rent again. So you can probably see what I'm thinking here is that in many cases, the little mum and dad type investor, they're the ones that have carried the burden here and done the heavy lifting. We've come across situations as well, and I'm not saying in all cases, where tenants have seen an opportunity and have abused the system. We've had situations as well where, in going to the tribunal where we've had issues, 9 times out of 10 they will side with the tenant. So look, working in the industry, we see this as a mess. It's a recipe for disaster. You're going to find more and more of these little investors, landlords, selling their investment properties to probably the bigger investors and landlords, who in fact will get the land tax relief. Some of these are associated with banks and super funds, so they get access to cheap finance. And in a lot of cases too, I think these investment properties will be bought by owner-occupiers. So in fact, there'll be less properties for rent, less investors, which means that rents will go up. So that means no winners, only losers. So they're my strong views in terms of what's happened this week. Obviously, if you are a landlord and investor and you want some advice, message us, contact us. We're here to give informed, honest, expert advice. Hopefully next week it'll be a more positive views, as I hope to have our property stylist join me and talk about preparing and presenting your property to get the best possible price. But until then, take care and look after each other. Thanks.